Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of the origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Lee Hall, who is a vertebrate paleontologist at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. His research focuses on two main groups of fossil animals, a group of huge armored fish that includes the famous Dunkleosteus, and the phylogenetics and functional morphology of dinosaurs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lee Hall.
Thank you for the introduction, Glenn, and thank you to you and Patricia for the invite to be part of this fantastic series. I've attended several of these over the years, and these have always been so informative, so I hope to do right by that. So my name is Lee Hall, and I'm a paleontologist at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And the photo above you, I think by the end of this lecture, will hopefully give you pause, give you something interesting to think about. Because as many times in paleontology and I suppose other sciences, something that can seem rather innocuous and something that maybe you don't even pay much attention to can end up taking up a significant portion of your time as you do research. And it's always fascinating to me because you end up learning so much about something that otherwise beforehand you may not have even given a second thought to. And that's what we're talking about tonight, is sauropod feet. So I work over at the Natural History Museum a few blocks from here. And my title is preparator, so my job is essentially to run the fossil lab. So we have a fossil lab in the basement of the museum, and I'm doing some consolidation treatment to an ancient camel there called Stenomylus. My day-to-day activities involve putting fossils back together or conserving them for future generations. But some of the most fun that I have is actually getting to collaborate with Case Western Reserve, doing presentations like this, or training students, some of whom are in the audience tonight. So don't be too hard on me, guys, please. So this study was made possible with the help of two people I need to mention. So Dr. Denver Fowler in the cowboy hat there, who initially dreamt up the concept for this research project back in 2009. And we presented this first part at a conference called the International Conference on Dinosaur Eggs and Babies. And we turned that presentation into a paper. And on the right there is Mrs. Ashley Hall. Now, she is my wife, so she's here tonight. I gotta say hi, dear. Thanks for being here, for your support. But yeah, so without Denver and without her work on the second half of the research, you know, we wouldn't be, I wouldn't be standing here with you tonight. So I just want to make sure that they are properly acknowledged and thanked for their help. In 2011, the first paper came out in the journal Historical Biology, and the second half of the study came out in 2016 in a specialty publication called Dinosaur Tracks: The Next Steps, which is a richly illustrated book that focuses on learning from dinosaur trackways or footprints and doing more than just measuring stride and gait, but trying to figure out paleobiological hypotheses of behavior and use new methods in paleontology. And after I made that sound very juicy and interesting, I'm only going to be talking about the first paper tonight, so you'll have to come back in November for part 2. So tonight we're going to go through 3 sections. The first one, we will talk about sauropod dinosaurs in general. Don't worry if you have never heard that word before or you don't know what a sauropod is, because we're all going to be on the same page after the first section. Then we'll jump into the sort of the meat of the research and talk about a couple of hypotheses involving sauropod claws. And then we will finish it off by trying to understand these interesting anatomical features by looking at evolutionary trends in the group of sauropod dinosaurs, as well as trying to figure out if we can look at modern biology of living animals to help understand what they use these claws for. Are we all on the same page? Very good. Part 1, sauropods. So there in the image behind me are sauropod dinosaurs. And pretty much everyone, whether they intended to or not, at some point in their life has probably seen something representing a sauropod dinosaur. If you've ever driven by a Sinclair oil station, you've seen a sauropod silhouetted. They're pretty hard to avoid, especially after all of the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World movies and King Kong and everything else. Sauropods were one of the most successful groups of dinosaurs. They evolved early in the Mesozoic, and as you can see here, they have a very healthy span throughout pretty much the entirety of what is called the Age of Dinosaurs, and they had a fairly healthy diversity too. And one of the really interesting things about sauropods is that, yes, even though they all have basically long necks and long tails and are really big, they go about getting those things in slightly different ways. And interestingly, so the classic distribution or division of dinosaur taxonomy has had sauropods nested with the saurischians, or the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, which means that these giant herbivores are more closely related to Velociraptor and T-Rex than they are to things like Stegosaurus or Triceratops, which belonged in the ornithischians. This has been thrown topsy-turvy more recently, as phylogenetic analyses are often responsible for doing. But for now, we'll just stick with sort of the classic division and have sauropods grouped in with the saurischians. So if we look at a geologic column, as represented here by Ray Troll's artwork, the Mesozoic here, the middle era of life, we'll zoom in, it spans from roughly 250 to 66 million years ago, and sauropods really evolved at the end of the Triassic, so that first third of the Age of Dinosaurs. And once you get into the Jurassic, they explode in diversity, and that's when you hear of some of the classic and most famous species of sauropod dinosaurs like Brontosaurus and Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus. And into the Cretaceous, you have diversification of a group of dinosaurs called Titanosaurs, which include things like Patagotitan, which is on display at the Field Museum now and at the American Museum, some of the absolutely largest terrestrial animals to ever walk the Earth. This is an image representing the diversity of sauropods. There are several groups, and you can see they all have in common that classic feature of relatively long necks and long tails, but again, some of them are held a little loftier than others. You can see in the middle of the screen, the Titanosaurs have rather long forearms, so their vertebrae sort of tilt upward towards the shoulder, and then the heads are lofted high into the air. The Diplodocids down in the bottom left, they are some of the longest dinosaurs, and they are essentially cantilevered over the shoulders and the hips. They have necks that are just about as long as their tails. And then up in the upper right are some of the weirdest sauropods, the Rhombachosauridae, which had the front of their skulls were flattened out. They almost look like how a vacuum cleaner with brushes flattens out. And the Dicraeosauridae, which had neural spines that grew out of the skin, and essentially the top of the vertebrae projected out of the neck about 3 feet or so. So sauropods, actually turns out they have a lot more morphological diversity than typically you'd be familiar with in pop culture. And then there's Camarasaurids down in the bottom right, which are sort of another classic Jurassic dinosaur type. And we're gonna not really focus on any one of those particular groups, so don't worry about trying to memorize all these something a days and something a dawn, because we're really just looking at broad evolutionary patterns, which is why I like this study, because you can just kind of pull back and just see where things are trending and where they're going. Another thing that's significant about sauropods, so there's a Camarasaurus skull on the upper left, which once upon a time was thought to be the skull of Brontosaurus, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if anyone's curious. But you see in the jaws in the upper right there, they have large, flat, spatulate teeth. They're very rounded. They're big. They're bigger than most people's thumbs would be. And then in the bottom, there's the skull of a Diplodocus, which is one of the longer sauropods. And the teeth at the front of the mouth are more pencil or peg-like. And what's going on here is essentially you have many of these gigantic animals living in the same environments at the same time. And you want to be able to exist, happily without having to compete with one another for the same food resource. So you're essentially seeing niche partitioning in the dentition, where the chimerosaurs or the spatulate-toothed sauropods were browsing higher up in trees, and things like Diplodocus with the peg-like teeth were raking in vegetation from the lower trophic levels in the fern forests and what have you. And just in case you don't know where the teeth are, I made a graph. Okay. So there's going to be a few cladograms in the talk, and if you're not familiar with a cladogram, it's essentially a very simple diagram that shows you degrees of relatedness among animals. It doesn't necessarily show you ancestor-descendant relationships. So these two cladograms are saying the exact same thing. If we progress, this is called a node. This is essentially an area where there's a branching event. You could hypothesize that there is a common ancestor shared between all three, and as you move up the tree, perhaps a common ancestor shared between A and B, but we're not putting any animal names there. So now that we have that out of the way, we can move into something a little bit more in depth. So this would be sort of a classic example where you have fish. Now, amphibians did evolve from an ancestor in the ocean, right? A fish ancestor. But when you group reptiles and amphibians, those two will be more closely related probably than either of them would be to fish. We clear? Okay. So same thing there. It doesn't matter the direction. This is probably even too much information because we're not actually going to use this for much other than to look at this diagram. Now, I'm not usually a fan of pictures with a lot of small stuff for a presentation, but essentially what this is showing you is a couple of things. This is what we talk about when we're talking about Sauropoda. So all these animals, I'm talking about all these names, they exist on this tree somewhere. Some of the more basal forms are up here, and more derived forms, meaning maybe they showed up a little bit later in the Mesozoic, in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, will show up as you move up to the crown of the tree. And if you're curious, that's where our museum logo, Haplocanthosaurus, comes from, right there. So Haplocanthosaurus is still kind of weird. We don't have a skull for it, and that makes it pretty difficult to figure out where it sits within the overall sauropod group. We'll see this diagram again, and it's just important that you sort of understand that as we move from sort of the upper left to the bottom right, we're sort of seeing a trend in evolution and evolutionary relationships in these animals. So background into the history of sauropod discoveries in the 1880s, 1870s or 80s. Anyway, a long time ago in a state far, far away, there was a geologist named Arthur Lakes. And Arthur Lakes actually would go out and while he was doing sections and drawing up geologic columns, you'd find fossils. And so what was sort of the norm back then was you'd have people out doing work on geology in the West, and then you had paleontologists back east at Yale or Harvard. And when people would find things out west, they would mail them or ship them by train out east and write letters back and forth when they'd find these things. So Arthur Lakes is a geologist. He's also famous because he would paint watercolors and do pastel work when he was out in the field. So here he is reclining at Como Bluff, Wyoming. There's records of people getting kind of irritated with him because when they'd be working and moving rocks, he'd be painting a picture. But we're really glad we have these color representations of field work from the sort of the early days of dinosaur paleontology. So one day, Arthur Lakes in 1877, he's out southwest of Denver, Colorado, in a town called Morrison, and he discovers what he calls the bones of some gigantic saurian, upper arm bone and a backbone, and he sends this letter to a guy named O.C. Marsh, who, if you've ever heard of the Bone Wars, was one of the pivotal players. It's a fascinating time in American history, and I wish I had time to get into it now, but it's worth looking up on your own. There's several good books. So this is the Denver area. There we go. And if you've ever flown into the airport's right up there, and this little red dot down here, that's Morrison, and then here's a map shot of it. So we're in southwestern Denver. There's Red Rocks Amphitheater. Anyone ever go see the Grateful Dead there? Go see a show? Well, it turns out Red Rocks is right across the canyon from where the bone wars began. So that entire ridge system that cuts across like a scar is called Dinosaur Ridge, and that is where these fossils were first found. So the first fossils of Brontosaurus and some of the first examples of Stegosaurus and Allosaurus were discovered right here. It's a fascinating historical site to visit. So they start digging, and they find bones, and they start putting them together. These are our earliest sort of attempts at reconstructing sauropod dinosaurs. And as you can see here, in 10 years, they were able to put together a little bit more of the skull, fill out a little bit more of the rib cage and whatnot. But our earliest ideas of these animals, whether they were sluggish and slow and lizard-like, and the tails were digging on the ground if they could barely walk on the ground, and then they were hanging out in the swamps if they were doing anything. And so a few years later, we're still looking at lethargic animals. They're still hanging out in the swamps. It's walking around on the ground, but this tail doesn't really have any structure to it. It's very loose and lizard-like. So this is kind of indicative of early misunderstandings with the anatomy of dinosaurs and sauropods, and why we have these erroneous ideas that are still propagated into modern pop culture. And then moving forward into the mid-20th century, finally, by the 1980s and 90s, we have better understanding of the anatomy of these animals. So this is sort of our current understanding. We know that they're active and they're warm-blooded and they're getting around, so we can start looking at some of the more interesting aspects of their behavior. Questions so far?
Your diagram, I guess you call it a cladogram.
Yep.
Is that based solely on DNA analysis, or on fossils, or
So we don't have DNA with dinosaurs because the molecule of DNA is completely obliterated after a few tens of thousands of years. So going back 100 million years or 120 million years is gone. The way that these diagrams are assembled is through careful scrutiny of the skeletal anatomy of these animals, and essentially determining what features of the skeletons are significant for determining a genus or species level separation. And that's difficult because when you're just looking at bones, and bones that have often have been crushed, and you don't necessarily have a complete skeleton, you might not even have a skull where a lot of that important information lies. Those diagrams get changed up a lot every year. So it's all hypothetical. It's all based on our best current understanding of the anatomy of these fossils, but it's always changing. So yeah, they're based on essentially analysis of the anatomy.
How do they reproduce?
Well, when a mommy dinosaur and a daddy dinosaur. That's a really good question, and sometimes those basic questions are the most difficult questions to answer, because what can you learn from a skeleton? So we're actually going to talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation, and I think part of your question will be answered, so I don't, spoiler warning, I don't want to give anything away. But as far as the physics, at least half the population had to get up on two legs once a year. And that's about all we know.
Not just lay eggs?
So dinosaurs did lay eggs, and so we have evidence of nests and eggs from pretty much every major clade of dinosaurs, from the meat eaters and the sauropods and the duck-billed dinosaurs. No eggs or nests for horned dinosaurs yet, and armored dinosaurs either, if I'm remembering correctly. But they did lay eggs. Hard-shelled eggs.
How do you know they were warm-blooded?
One of the interesting things with that question is, how do we know they were warm-blooded? There are a few different definitions and a few different ways to become warm-blooded. Were they necessarily warm-blooded like you or I? I think we're homeothermic endotherms. We essentially generate our own body heat, and then we maintain that body heat with our metabolism. And I don't think dinosaurs all maintained their body temperatures the same way. And if you're a sauropod and you get to be 100 feet long, once you heat up, it's really hard to dump that heat off. The reason we know so much about dinosaur physiology is because the Bones, although they fossilize, retain internal tissues. So the bone tissues, the structure, microstructure of bone tells us a lot about dinosaur metabolism. So when you cut open a dinosaur leg, you can see the different layers of deposited bone that were essentially laid down like tree rings as the animal grew. And you can calculate growth rates from that, and there's a bunch of fancy statistics you can do that I don't necessarily know how to do or explain. However, the basic answer is that the bones, we can do histology on those bones, and under the microscope they reveal quite a bit of information about their physiology, and from that we know that many of them were very fast growing, fast maturing animals, which is indicative of a high metabolism, much like modern birds.
Thank you for joining us. You have been watching Lee Hall discussing sauropods, the iconic long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs, among whom were the largest animals to ever walk the earth. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Mr. Hall will focus on competing hypotheses, digging and walking for the shape of sauropods' feet and claws. Now, back to the talk.
We're going to talk about a couple of hypotheses with dinosaur claws, scratch digging versus substrate grip. So what's in a name? I always like to throw, I don't realize, it's Shakespeare, I think, but so what's in a name? Well, this is the guy, O.C. Marsh. He's the guy who started the bone wars against Edward Cope, who also has wonderfully crazy facial hair appropriate of the period. He coined the name Sauropoda in 1878. Now, when you take a look at the anatomical features of your typical sauropod skeleton, what's going to stand out right away? I mean, they're big. They've got massively long necks with proportionately small heads, although these skulls were at least the size of a horse skull on the small end, and usually larger than that. Long tails. They have these massive hips that are about the size of the engine block of a pickup truck. But for Marsh, he was really interested, I guess, in their feet, because the name sauropod means lizard foot. It was very vogue in the late 1800s to name groups of dinosaurs based on their feet. Theropod dinosaurs, which include T-Rex and other meat eaters, that means beast foot, and then sauropod means lizard foot, and then duckbill dinosaurs belong in a group called ornithopods, which means bird foot. And so when you look at their feet, well, if you look at a lizard foot, there's some loose similarities between like this varianted lizard foot and the foot of some early sauropodomorphs from the Triassic around 200 million years ago. And you just have to take my word for it. But beyond that, there's really not a whole lot going on there where I would say, well, this is, something that would be indicative of calling it a lizard-footed animal. When you look at the sauropod foot skeleton, that's the hand on the left and the foot on the right. And so if we go back and forth between the lizard, sauropod, lizard, sauropod. So I'm not sure what was going through Marsh's mind at the time, and I wasn't able to dig up anything, but I'm sure he had a good reason for it at the time. So just take a moment and look at those things. So there's no bones missing from that hand. So what you're looking at is from a fairly derived sauropod. So this is something like a brachiosaurus or an apatosaurus. Essentially, if you take all your distal fingertips off and just leave that first digit and then stick your thumb out, you've made a sauropod hand. Congratulations. Now walk around on that. And with the foot, or the Pes, they retain these 3 large claws, and they've gotten rid of sort of 2 of the outer claws. The one thing in common in these 2 limbs is that you'll see both the metacarpals and the metatarsals, or the long bones of the hand. They're arranged in a semicircular column. They're very stout. These bones are bigger than bread loaves each. So, and they're massive. They could be as big as your torso in some of these dinosaurs. And this is where things kind of get interesting, because if you look at the foot of a sauropod, you can sort of key the bones in. So the blue, those are the metatarsals, the long bones under the ankle. The green, those are your phalanges or the toe bones. And then the yellow, those are the specialized toe bones that have been essentially modified into a big claw. And if you're wondering what your foot, how that would compare, I'll do that for you right now with a little bit of PowerPoint magic. There we go. And so again, blue, that's the long bones of your foot. So if you have a fallen arch, you can blame that blue group in there. And then our toe tips, they're not giant claws, but we have these thin little claw sheaths that sort of stick out of the skin there on our distal phalanges. So now that you're all experts in sauropod foot anatomy, we can learn about feet and what they tell us. So feet are very informative. And it turns out when you look at, if you compare any particular piece of anatomy from one animal across several animal groups, you'll see that they sort of vary based on evolutionary heritage, but also, how these animals make a living. So, predators have sharp claws. The insectivore primate there in the upper right, the eye's got this long, weird finger for poking, tapping trees and fishing grubs out of holes. A sloth obviously has claws that look really vicious, but they're meant for climbing trees. Geckos have these really wild feet that they use to cling on to and climb. And then, amphibians like frogs have the web feet for swimming. So I think that sort of drives the point home over and over again. You can learn a lot from feet. So this is the front foot of a sauropod. As you can see, it's very stout. And again, there's one thumb claw and the rest of the tips of those toes are gone. So by the time you get into the Jurassic, this is kind of what sauropod feet look like. And this is from our own Haplocanthosaurus at the Natural History Museum. So you can come and see these yourself in person. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And this is the Sauropod Pes. And if you look, that's my shoe. So to give you an idea of how big these animals are. So, and this isn't even the biggest of big sauropods. So there's an interesting sort of arrangement. If you look right overhead, you can see the claws. So they have sort of an echelon overlapping pattern. Held in a neutral position, they sort of tip towards the inside of the foot. And so medially, the claws, we say they're canted medially, or they tip kind of medially. The bottoms of them kind of spread out towards the side, away from the center of the body. And they make this, there's a really interesting angle there. I just want to drive that point home because we're going to be looking at this. And what's really interesting about those claws is that they have what's called an offset flexor tubercle. Now, to simplify that, your body is essentially a bunch of pulley systems with muscles and tendons, and you're making your skeleton move. And so for a sauropod, whenever they wanted to flex their feet down, so if you imagine trying to pick up a marble with your toes, everyone's probably flexing their toes down into the ground. Your tendons are pulling your toes, and your toes are going straight down, perpendicular to the surface of the earth. But with sauropods, their flexor tubercle, or the little part of the bone where the tendon would attach to pull the claw down, was offset kind of medially or toward the midline of the body. So when they flex their foot, the claws would actually, and I'll do my animation again here, they would actually kind of tip over and fold over and stack across the front of the foot in a really, really bizarre articular arrangement, which is completely unique to this group of dinosaurs. So we call this plantar flexion, and there's someone doing some exercises, but in the bottom there, plantar flexion is essentially when you tip your foot away from your body and curl your toes down. So we're going to be talking about this particular behavior in sauropods. And this is just about as niche as I think you can get in any study. I mean, this is like, who would have thought we'd be talking about feet moving down? You're like, I want to hear about dinosaurs, and we're talking about feet. What's going on here? So plantar flexion is essentially going to give you an arrangement, and I've illustrated it here with the claws sort of folding down and overlapping. This is such a bizarre articulation and movement that it was difficult for me after several attempts to draw to some satisfaction. But the important thing is that we're looking at what happens when these claws are flexed and they end up overlapping and forming more or less one continuous surface perpendicular to the front of the foot. So what's going on here? Sauropod feet are weird. That's one thing. They should have been called weird foot, right? Instead of lizard foot. Well, here are the hypotheses. So number one, substrate grip. So maybe when they're walking around, maybe they're walking through mud, it's a little slippery, maybe they're walking through some loose sediment, the feet engage this flexion, and the claws help keep a grip on the ground. You don't want to fall down if you weigh 40 tons or whatever. So we would be familiar with off-road tread on vehicles or cleats on athletic shoes, or hiking shoes. That helps us essentially keep a grip on the ground when we're climbing around artificially. And so in sauropods, it may have prevented slipping and provided traction and prevented something like this from happening. That's terrible. But the issue with, as dramatic a scene as this is we actually have fossil sites where all we find are sauropod feet, or all we find are essentially the legs preserved because they got stuck in the mud. And then the top parts of the skeletons just eroded away. So it leaves a little bit to be desired as far as trying to explain what selection pressure was significant enough to essentially across the board, create this feature. Hypothesis number 2, scratch digging. If anyone's ever had a dog or maybe a problematic rodent in their garden, essentially you just use your paws or your hands to dig into the ground. And probably not for burrowing in sauropods. This seems a little bit unrealistic. So what good is it to have a digging implement on your hind foot if you're 100 feet long? Perhaps nest excavation. So we're going to talk a little bit about reproduction. Well, how do you go about determining one way or the other which of these is, more valid than the other if it's possible? Well, so we do have fossils from sauropod nests, and we can probably look at some of those. We have nesting grounds, especially famously down in South America, and we're going to talk about that in the next section. But we're just going to take a few questions now. So I'm happy to answer questions from the last session or questions about sauropod foot anatomy. And I'm running a little bit quick here, so make them good.
Were these creatures North America, or were they all over the entire world?
Global. They've been found on every continent, including Antarctica. And kudos to the paleontologists who went to Antarctica to look for fossils and dug up a sauropod.
Are they still discovering new species of dinosaurs, and when was the last one? If no, when was the last one discovered?
It seems just about once a month there's some new species of dinosaur coming out. One of the most recent major species of sauropods from the last year would have been Dreadnoughtus. Brontosaurus has been an off-again, on-again species in paleontology for like over 100 years. And this is because back in the 1800s, marsh these big bones were found. We were finding lots of big bones all over, and these guys, Marsh and Cope, were really fighting each other in the press and in the scientific publications to see who could get the most publications, and they took out ads in major newspapers insulting each other for several years, and it really soured a lot of relationships. But they were so fixated on trying to outpublish the other person that a lot of times they got sloppy, and so the slightest perceived difference in fossils meant there was a new species. And so this was sort of the case with something called Brontosaurus excelsius, which stands for the regal thunder lizard. So as it turns out, upon closer inspection after these guys died in the early 1900s, other paleontologists were trying to sort through the mess, and it turns out that the bones of Brontosaurus were really similar to a already described animal named Apatosaurus, and so they ended up lumping Brontosaurus back into Apatosaurus. But by that point, there were already museum exhibits up, and there was this movie called King Kong that had come out, and there was a Brontosaurus in there, so it was in the popular culture. So for many, many years, Brontosaurus has essentially been considered like a wastebasket taxon. It's been in the graveyard of scientific names until more recently. A publication came out in like 2015, I think, where it was resurrected as a valid genus, and there are currently 3 proposed species of Brontosaurus. So it's cool to be Brontosaurus again. But the point being, there's so many different species of dinosaurs being published annually that sometimes it's hard to keep track.
How old did these guys get, roughly?
So using histology, you can count the growth rings inside the bone and get a rough estimate for age. And with most dinosaurs, when you are pushing your 30s, you're up there. So we're not looking at like 100 years, not like tortoises. They lived fast and died youngish, but 30 years for a giant animal in the wild's kind of, I think that's rather typical. But what's really amazing is how big these animals got in that amount of time. It's averaging anywhere from 10 to 20 feet upwards to over 100 feet long in some of those groups.
I want to go back to the overlapping claws for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Does that not constitute a blade-like action? A blade, like
Yes.
a plow blade, or
Yes. As far as weaponry, that's an interesting thought, and to use that hind foot like a weapon, the animal would have to be in pretty dire straits. I think that at a certain point, a sauropod probably, whether intentionally or not, kicked something, if it was walking or if there was a predator trying to get up at its belly. But these limbs are huge, and the animals, they're heavy, and so you don't want to be removing one of your main supports if you don't have to. So as far as evolving things for weaponry, it's really hard to show that. And that's another thing that goes back to early 20th century paleontologists, writing popular press books and saying, oh, everything's about tooth and claw and blood and gore, and Triceratops horns are strictly for defense and it had a shield. And we know now that we have the benefit of knowing more because they did the work before us. So I don't want to poo-poo the work. We know enough now that a lot of these crazy features in dinosaurs, like the armor and the spikes, I'm sure some of it was useful in a combative situation, but we're seeing more evidence for sexual selection and species recognition being the driving force of a lot of these crazy skeletal features. So what dinosaurs did with their bones is kind of what birds do with their feathers and their plumage today. So if you see a Triceratops skull with that big frill, think of the peacock throwing its tail up and showing off.
So we have explanations for what was going on with the claws on the back feet, but do we have any big theories on why they just have the one claw on the front?
So the thing about dividing a presentation up into thirds and sections is you're trying to anticipate a narrative, and inevitably a clever audience will always be thinking ahead, which is great. It's just I haven't shown you some pictures yet. But as far as the selection pressures for that, it could have been useful if they were rasping bark off trees, or for the males, it probably was good to have once a year, like I said earlier. But so far we don't really understand sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs, or if it even exists. So at this point, it's all still largely speculative. So if you're looking for something to do in grad school, there's a project.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Lee Hall. Mr. Hall is preparator of vertebrate paleontology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. He has excavated Troodon nests from Montana, megalodon teeth from beneath the streets of downtown Los Angeles, sea caves in Alaska, and late Cretaceous dinosaurs in southern Alberta, Canada. In the second part of our talk, we discussed how useful sauropods' claws would be for digging holes in the dirt versus for providing traction on slippery surfaces. In our final segment, Mr. Hall will talk about how we can study modern animals to learn about dinosaurs. Now, back to our talk.
Part 3, trends and analogues, and evolution and living clues. So this is my favorite part of the talk because this is sort of the payoff for sitting patiently, and we start to see some neat ideas being discussed. So we're going to look at the evolution of sauropod feet going sort of up the tree here. And I'll do that again just so everyone can see, because I spent a lot of time in this arrow. So yeah, we're basically, we want to understand, okay, if these claws are an important feature, and we're trying to figure out what they were used for, we want to try and understand maybe what selection pressures are driving the evolution of these features. Well, if we start at the beginning, sauropods got big pretty early on. So there's going to be some external constraints. They're big, they're heavy, so the limbs are going to be fairly columnar, the feet and hands are going to be stout, and number one, they have to be able to support a lot of weight. But number two, they're doing something with their claws. So we'll start with the feet. So there's sort of that lizard-footed sort of prosauropod Lophangosaurus on the far left. And as we march up sort of the evolutionary ladder, you can see that they lose the two outermost claws, and then they hypertrophy or enlarge the claws in the first three toes. So the big toe is truly a big toe here. So they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, if we look at the hands, and this is really crucial, we'll see that they started off with a fairly large manus with fairly sizable claws in them. And then as you move up the tree, they actually lose them altogether in a few select groups. So that Episthocoelicaudia on the far right, that's not a mistake. It completely lost every single bone past the knuckle. So if you've ever walked around on your fists, I mean, you're walking like one of these animals would have. So the question then becomes, we look at these hypotheses of scratch digging and substrate grip, and we try to analyze them now with an understanding of the evolutionary context of these features. And so if you look across these animals, they're getting bigger and bigger foot claws, and they're retaining the foot claws, so clearly the foot claws are important. But in a lot of cases, they're removing most of the claws from the hand except for the mysterious thumb claw, or in some cases, getting rid of them entirely. So back in 1989, Mark Gallup published an interesting paper about the foot of a dinosaur. In this paper, it's called Pleurocoelus. It's been lumped in with another dinosaur called Astrodon, whatever. It's a big sauropod. But he talked about this idea of scratch digging. Now, he wasn't the first person to bring it up, but this was the most thorough discussion about it that had happened. And I think he mentions it like 3 or 4 times in the paper. But you can see a foot is mentioned there. And essentially, his arguing was that there is a special articular relationship when you look at these foot claws. There's actually quite a bit of range of motion possible in the toes of the hind feet. Even though there would have been a big fleshy pad for standing and a lot of muscle tissue, the claws were still capable of a great range of motion. So they were mobile. So we know that they weren't just kind of sitting doing nothing. And in a study by Matt Bonnet in 2005, he again looked at the articular relationship of the anatomy of the claws and said, yeah, they can do this cool movement and they can fold over and form sort of a blade across the front of the foot. But he didn't think scratch digging was viable because, as he says here, the claws did not appear to penetrate the soil parallel with the feet as they do in digging mammals. So what he means is, if you were to dig a hole with your hand, okay, the direction of your limb's motion, if you had a big claw coming off the front, if your fingernails were really long, the broadest part of your fingernail would be utilized properly for digging, okay? If you tried moving your hand sideways through the soil, you're going to slice through. So what Bonnet is saying here is that because while the sauropod foot is sort of held in a neutral position, the claws are not oriented ideally for digging, but he says like they are in digging mammals. And again, he says they twisted and flexed into the soil perpendicular to the direction of locomotion. And then he kind of left it at that. And I can understand because the study was mostly about the physiology of sauropod hands and feet. It was a big paper, and this was just sort of a minor note. So I don't want to be too hard on him about that. So we need to look at some modern analogs, and let's start with an elephant because sauropods are big, and a lot of times when you see sauropods in popular culture or toys of these things, their feet look just like elephants. If we compare the hand skeleton of a sauropod to an elephant, you have these big metacarpals, and then you have a reduction in the limbs. This is actually not a bad analogy, minus the giant claw. However, there's a marked difference in the footprint. So an elephant foot, both the front feet and the back feet, they're just like sewer lids. They're big and they're round. Sauropod front feet have these big, fat, fleshy pads on them. But on a sauropod front foot, if we look at a track here of a right and a left, or a right forefoot and hind foot, or hand and a foot, I could just say the easy words. You can see that there's a sort of a bean-shaped or kind of a semilunate crest. So sauropods didn't have a fleshy heel on their hand, and we have tens of thousands of trackways that tell us that this isn't an anomaly. So right there, the analogy with elephant feet breaks down. And again, with sauropod feet, some of those are about 1 meter long, and you can see some of the impressions from the claws there. We won't get into this too much this time, but for the next lecture, we certainly are going to dive into trackways. So if you look at the hind foot, I think it's pretty apparent that you can't make much of a comparison there because elephants don't have claws, they have nails. Okay, so that's not going to work. Well, let's look at digging mammals now because that was mentioned in one of the studies. And so there's a wombat on the left, and you can see it's got these flat broad claws that stick out straight from the front of the foot. Same thing with the mole there. So his argument is essentially saying that, sauropods don't move their claws like mammals, so they couldn't have dug like mammals, which is true. They're not mammals. But the analogy falls apart because he's not considering the motion of the foot with the flexion of the claws engaged. So in the initial idea, the broad claws of moles are great for digging, but sauropods, this is a cross-section through the claw, mind you. So if we were to be really cruel and chop through the middle of the claws of these animals, that's what the cross-section would look like. Moles are good for digging structurally, sauropods not so much. When they move into the soil, sauropod claws aren't very efficient for digging in this position. So mole wins. However, if we consider the flexion of the sauropod claws and the angle that they'd be laying at once that anatomical anomaly, the mechanism was engaged, it's a different picture entirely, and they become actually rather efficient. And they become a great, like a hoe, like a garden hoe. Yeah, I see some of that. I told you so, yeah. So what's really interesting is not only would these make something like a good scraper, but if you've worked in industry like I have for a little bit as a paleontologist, I watched a lot of holes get drilled for solar fields and for power lines and things, and they use these things called rock augers, which is on the right there. And it turns out that the little teeth that are on those auger flights, when they move, they're overlapped and shaped not so dissimilar from sauropod claws. So sauropod feet might be a good analogy for, looking at rock augers instead of digging mammals. But this is actually the best modern analog for a sauropod foot. This is a gopher tortoise, which is a beautiful animal, and you can see that there's a little dirt on top of the shell of this. I think that's a male. You can tell because they'll have usually males might have a long, what's called a gular horn. So the bottom part of the shell where the collarbone is in us has a long stem that kind of sticks out. And so they can use it for fighting other tortoises. For them, it's very serious, but for us, it's cute. Look at their fighting. So these are tortoise feet, and at the top there they are with the flesh on A on the top is the hand, and C on the bottom is the hand. They're flipped, but as you can see, they have fairly stout phalanges or finger bones, and they have fairly broad claws. And this is good because turtles, being reptiles, are more closely related to sauropods than mammals are. And turns out of all the animals. So here again, showing you the sauropod foot compared to tortoise claws. This is where in our study we're seeing more similarities, and we're kind of going, Now, if only tortoises did something really interesting with their foot claws, like burrow, which they do. And of all the animals in the animal kingdom that you would look at and say, yeah, that's a burrower. Tortoises are at the bottom of the list with that big shell. It's just nuts. But they actually dig very long and elaborate burrows. They can be several meters deep and like 20 feet long. And they're good habitat for a lot of animals, some snakes and owls and rodents, or squatters, as the tortoises probably call them. But tortoises are really, really good diggers. And they actually dig with their hind feet. And there's actually a little bit more to it. So we know that the sauropods probably aren't burrowing with their feet. So what else could they be doing with those feet and digging? Well, so when tortoises lay eggs, the females, they dig a nest. So in this image here, you can see that she's using her right foot to scrape dirt out of the hole and spread it away from where she's going to deposit her eggs. And then she will switch over, and the left foot comes in, reaches down, digs in, and starts to remove sediment. So this is making us wonder if there might be something relatable here with sauropods, because that's a pretty important thing to be able to do if you want to keep the pack living. So diagrammed here, the tortoise will stick one foot into the ground, excavate some sediment, pile it in a pile or flick it away, and then put the other foot into the ground to excavate until the burrow is several tens of centimeters deep. And then the other interesting factoid is that they will urinate onto the soil and pack it down in order to keep the burrow, the nest, from collapsing before they lay their eggs. And then they use their feet to bury it again. So I mean, they can't see what they're doing. I don't know if you can tell by the picture, but they don't have a rear view mirror on their shell. So they're doing this all by feel. And they've got the clumsiness of that big shell. And so what we're curious about is like, well, what does a sauropod nest look like? So this is a sauropod nest here. As you can see, it's not made of sticks and twigs like a bird nest, but it's actually excavated into the ground, and it's a somewhat oblong shape. And if we look at publication images from a site called Acamuevo in South America, in the center of each of those pictures, you'll see the circular or spherical sauropod eggs. Those two, scattering of them there. That's probably the most round of the nest, but you can see the sort of elongated way that the eggs are deposited into a trough. And that's a scientific illustration. So there's a rim around the nest as well. So there's soil that's been piled up around here, which lends evidence to excavation. And then if we look at pictures of the nests taken in the field after they remove the eggs, in the back walls of the excavations, you can actually see that the sauropods dug deep enough, and this was in all the nests I look at, the sauropods excavated into the ground deep enough to expose cross-bedded strata that had been deposited in the soil before they got there. So sauropod nests are not built, in this case, on top of the ground surface. There's evidence for them actually being excavated into the soil. And that would look something like this, where the sauropod comes along and deposits the eggs into the trough. Were they capable of excavating the nests themselves? Well, we think so, because the trough-like elongate structure of the nest seems to lend itself to a big animal using its hind legs, maybe one, maybe both, switching, and then probably doing a little bit of a crouching, probably not letting the eggs drop 10 feet into the nest. But as this figure here shows you, the nests are there's stratigraphic evidence and now potentially anatomical evidence for scratch digging being adaptation for nesting. So there's our current understanding that scratch digging helps life find a way, as it were. And so that is end of part one of this lecture, this study, and we're going to look into trackways in the second part, because as it turns out, if you want to figure out what sauropod feet were doing in the mud, in those slippery substrates, there's fossil evidence for that in thousands of trackways across the world. And that's a child sitting in a footprint full of water. They're taking a bath. Texas, right?
Any evidence that they would bury the eggs then, cover them? I see the pictures kind of showing them visible, but then they would be vulnerable to predators.
Yeah, so, and the interesting thing is that sauropods are thought to essentially have laid the eggs and then left them. So they weren't really, other than making the nests, they weren't doing any monitoring. So when the young hatched, they had to sort of figure things out on their own. And the evidence for whether or not the eggs were buried comes from looking at the microstructure of the eggshell, because not all dinosaur eggshells created the same. And looking at little pores in the eggshell, you can determine the gas conductance efficiency of the egg as a whole. So if an eggshell is, well, how does this work? If it's porous or if it's not porous. Yeah. So I don't want to misspeak here, but essentially sauropod eggshell gas conductance based on porosity tells us that they would have probably been partially buried in vegetation. And so sort of like what you see with crocodiles. And so I think when the eggs are buried under vegetation, they need a higher porosity because you need to have oxygen supplying coming into the egg. Whereas if the eggs are exposed subaerially on the surface, you don't need as many pores because you're exposed to the air, which would have been the case in Sauropod dinosaurs, which would have, some of them would have brooded on top of the eggs.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.